Magandang araw! Good day to all the participants of the Tam-awan International Arts Festival. My name is Fong, and today I'm going to be sharing with you on the topic Nurturing Culture at the Time of COVID-19 and Online Technology. So first, start with culture. What is culture? Some people say culture is on the loose, culture is everywhere. So we have a culture of corruption, we have a culture of impunity or culture of violence. And we also see culture used in agriculture, cancel culture, culture of resilience. And then we also see culture in the National Commission on Culture and the Arts and the Cultural Center of the Philippines. So what really is culture? It seems to be defined in different ways based on who is using the concept culture. For me, I define culture very simply as a way of life, as your way of life, as your way of living during this time, or it's a people's way of life. Our lifestyles, our ways of living are our responses to our environment, to the world we live in, to our natural world, to our spiritual worlds, and our lifestyles or our way of doing things are also determined by the people we relate with. This period of the pandemic is interesting because part of our culture, part of our daily living is now using masks and face shields. So it has become part of our lifestyle or our culture. Speaking of culture as a response to our environment, we now know that people who live in the lowlands or in the flatlands have different ways of doing things, have different ways of planting rice, as compared to people who live in mountains or in highlands. People who live in mountains have also developed their own ways of culturing or planting their rice and doing other things. And when we say these things, we see a distinction of lifestyles among people who live in the lowlands and lifestyles of those who live in the mountains. Therefore, a conclusion that we can get here is that culture now becomes an identity. So for example, a person who lives in the mountain lives in certain ways, and therefore these ways of living, these lifestyles, become part of his or her identity as a person who lives in the mountain. So we have mountain culture, or in our case in the Cordillera, we now have a Cordillera culture versus lowland culture. Anthropology has differentiated between material culture and non-material culture. So for anthropologists, the things we see around us, the things people have produced to live their lives are part of material cultures. For example, the houses that we build, the tools that we use in our farms, the things that we use to pound rice, this will now be part of what we call material culture. Things we can hold, things we can sit on. This will consist material culture. The other side will be non-material culture. Things that we do and believe in and we hold in our minds and our heads, which are still part of our lifestyles. They are the non-material things that drive the things that we do. So our beliefs, our thoughts, and the words that we speak, language. Language is a very good example of non-material culture. So many groups of people have developed their own set of words or language to deal with their own environments and to speak with other people. But part of non-material culture also would be songs, music, dances, and rituals. Now, during this pandemic, culture has come to the fore because we need to survive, and groups of people have to draw on their own respective cultures to help them survive the pandemic. So for instance, if we examine the languages of different groups of people, of different cultural groups, we observe that some people are now going back to their language to find out if they have local words for quarantine. And just as an example, for the indigenous language of Baguio, we found out that in the Ibaloy dictionary, there's a local word for quarantine. It is Kudintinas. And it may have come out during World War II when certain groups of people will need to be isolated, perhaps because they have become infectious for contacting disease somewhere. So they had to be isolated from the community so that they will not infect their group mates. So Codintinas, but it may have come from a Spanish word really, cuarentena, but it has become localized and it is now Codintinas. Also in the news, we've heard that some cultural groups have refused the help of government in relation to relief because the claim is that they have their own local practices, they have their own best practices to take care of their own community members during times of pandemics and emergencies. So what we observe now is we're seeing cultural groups drawing from their own cultures in order to survive the pandemic. And this is good. This is good. We should really be drawing from our own indigenous cultures to help us during these difficult times. We've also mentioned that culture includes beliefs, and including religious beliefs or faiths. And I'm sure that many people are drawing from their own indigenous beliefs or learned religious beliefs to help them, to give them strength. Also, cooperation is part of traditional culture. And we're glad to see cultural groups cooperating with one another, helping each other to survive the pandemic. In relation to online technology, the pandemic has forced all of us to live our lives online. So, for instance, this taping of this presentation or of this sharing has become part of living in the pandemic context. But on social media, we now see people, individuals, performing their cultures online, to share their cultures online. I don't know if the pandemic has forced us to do this, but apparently so. Now, in relation to cultures, we are now seeing best practices being projected online. And this is good. The problem, however, would be a problem in translation. We know that local cultures are embedded in local languages. So therefore, there is a need for people who want to perform their cultures online to help the general audience understand or make meanings out of local or indigenous cultures. So translation is very important. It is a challenge for indigenous peoples who want to make the cultures understandable to a larger audience, to exert some effort in translation, to explain local concepts or indigenous concepts to the larger audience. And so this is a challenge. How do we translate, for the sake of the general audience, some of our indigenous knowledges and practices or our indigenous cultures? Thank you. I hope you all gained something from this sharing. Very interesting question. Thank you for the question. I would think that what we heard on the news in relation to the pandemic about cultural groups refusing government aid is a very significant development in relation to drawing from indigenous culture. While people are lining up for relief goods or for amelioration packages, there's this leader who has claimed that culturally they had the means to support each other from the wealth of the community. And this is really very interesting even for me to know. And this has been big news at the start of this pandemic. Another very interesting question. Yeah, recently, the concept of cultural appropriation came up. Some cultural groups were offended that other people were using their cultural elements to make money. Perhaps if there is no money element, it would have been okay because it would be sharing culture, and it shows us that culture is dynamic. It can be used in different spheres. While many indigenous cultural groups are poor, some other enterprising individuals are making money out of the cultural wealth of those who are economically poor but culturally rich. This teaches us to be more careful. Culture is out there and it can be easily shared or it can be easily embraced by others. There is really this sensitivity among cultural groups to how their cultures are used by others. Yeah, so it's really an issue. It is a challenge on how we strike a balance to benefit the cultural owners and those who may appropriate the culture.